morning, everyone, and welcome to this session hosted by the Committee on Climate Change to explore how local authorities can deliver the UK's net zero ambitions. My name is Piers Forster and I sit on the Climate Change Committee, and for my day job I'm a professor of climate science at the University of Leeds, and I am particularly excited to be hosting this important webinar today because the carbon budget work from the committee has really shown that over half the emission cuts that we have to make as a society do really rely on people and businesses to take up the low carbon solutions, and these are decisions that are best made locally. So, and it's absolutely transparent that we aren't going to be able to achieve our net zero target without central government really empowering local authorities to deliver the change. And this is what we'll be discussing today. Our first speaker will be David Joffe, who's head of carbon budgets at the committee, and he will be talking about our carbon budget recommendations. Then we have Louise Marix who will talk about her excellent local authority report that was commissioned by the CCC, and it was published alongside our carbon budget. And she's a sustainability consultant with over 20 years experience providing all sorts of advice to local authorities and cities on how to tackle climate change. And she was also a lot of fun to work with on this fantastic document. And after her presentation, we have two esteemed panelists will give short responses. First up will be Marvin Rees, who's the mayor of Bristol, and he will talk about the proactive role that the British City Council the Bristol City Council is taking to address climate change, and he'll also reflect on how national, regional and local government can effectively partner to deliver net zero. And then we have Sue Halliwell, who's the Executive Director for Place at West Berkshire Council and co-chair of the South East Board of TEPT, the Association of Directors of Environment, Economy, Planning and Transport. But she's speaking today on behalf of the coalition behind the blueprint for accelerating climate action and green recovery. And she's going to be responding on behalf of this blueprint coalition. So we will, at the end, we will have 25 minutes for questions and answers. And please can you submit your questions in the Q&A chat box on the bottom right-hand side. And we probably only have time to answer some of the more popular ones. So please vote the ones that you do particularly want answer, but we will certainly be interested in all of them. So just please take advantage of that question and answer chat box. Okay, so that's enough from me. So I'd like to pass straight over to David, who's going to introduce some of our carbon budget work. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Piers, and good morning, everyone. Can we have the next slide, please, Louise? The sixth carbon budget recommendation that we made in December is the first time we've recommended a carbon budget on the way to the net zero target. So the net zero target was set in law in 2019, but the carbon budgets are intended to give the stepping stones to reaching that 2050 target. And this is the first time we've recommended one. Can you move the animation on, please, Louise? So we have 3 carbon budgets. Two have already happened. We're in the 3rd carbon budget period. We have 2 more that were already in law previously, and we've just recommended the 6th carbon budget. Now, the 6th carbon budget, you'll see the dotted line. Sorry, if we could move back. You'll see the dotted line for the path for emissions is steeper during the next 15 years, both than it has been historically and that it is between 2035 and 2050. So we see this as a decisive period, the next 10 or 15 years, to get ourselves on track to net zero and to really reduce the cumulative emissions as much as possible on the path to net zero as well. So we've got nearly 2/3 of the emissions reduction between now and 2050 in the first half of the period. But the other thing that we'll need to achieve by 2035 is having the frameworks in place that will drive emissions down further afterwards. So by 2035, at the latest, every new car, for example, will need to be zero emissions. So even after 2035, as petrol and diesel cars get to the end of their life, they'll be replaced by zero emission vehicles and will continue to reduce emissions. So we need to crack this problem in the next 10 or 15 years, both by reducing emissions and getting the frameworks in place to drive them down to net zero thereafter. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, so we've looked across the economy at the various different ways to reduce emissions, and we've produced 5 different scenarios that can get to net zero in or before 2050. The ways of doing that are varied, but broadly speaking, they're on the demand side, both efficiency and behavior change. It's electrification, some use of hydrogen, but pretty limited. Decarbonising the energy supply that we already have, and then also greenhouse gas removals, both from tree planting and peatland restoration and from more engineered types. So there's a real mix here. We have different mixes across our different scenarios, but the mixes actually aren't that different because some of the solutions are pretty clear in a number of these areas. Okay, if we can move to the next slide, please. So one of the things that we're able to do in our most recent analysis was actually break out the investment requirements to get on track to net zero. And you can see that by 2030, we're talking about an extra 50 or 60 billion pounds a year investment. But the other thing you see here below the axis is actually how much we're saving. This is very largely saving that we currently spend on fossil fuels that we'll no longer have to spend. And by 2050, you see that saving on fossil fuels is bigger than the annual investment requirement. So actually by then, we're breaking even, but in the interim period, there's a period where we're having to invest more in the new solutions than we'll be saving in terms of our fossil fuel spending. But this is a really interesting framing where it's a big chunk, sustained chunk of investment to get us on a net zero track, and eventually that will the savings will balance with that investment requirement. Okay, if we move on to my final slide, please. Okay, so this pie chart shows the mix of measures that we have in our scenarios. There are some things that require big efforts on behalf of people, and that's around 16% in this scenario. There are some that don't require really any behavioural change. We think, the decarbonisation of the electricity supply that we've seen already, people don't even notice. So those sorts of things. And there's around the same amount that's a combination of technology and behavior. So, for example, switching to an electric car is a behavior change, but it's also technology. So these are the relative sizes of the emission savings by 2035. They're all important, and we need all of them. The thing to say about this societal and behavioral change is actually, and particularly in the context of the local dimension that we're talking about this morning, is that a lot of those changes come with health benefits. And those health benefits will tend to be in the area where the changes are taking place. So whether we're talking about more walking and cycling, the exercise benefits will accrue to the people who are doing the walking and cycling, but there'll also be air quality benefits in the local area. If we're talking about changes in diet, again, the people who are making those changes will feel the health benefits. So there's very much a local dimension to the behavioural changes that mean that the areas that manage to transition the best and achieve the most in terms of those positive changes can also benefit the most, even outside of climate change, simply through the wider benefits of action. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, and I'll let Louise talk about our local work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. So yeah, I'm going to talk through the report I did last year on local authorities and the 6th carbon budget. And I'll just outline the 3 chapters for that report, which covers why does local delivery matter, what local authorities are doing now on climate change, and what needs to happen to deliver the 6th carbon budget. And then I'll cover overarching recommendations to local authorities and, importantly, to government. So why does local delivery matter? Can't we just do this all through top-down decisive policy? As David mentioned, half of the emissions that we've got to make rely on purchasing or behaviour decisions made by people, businesses, organisations, people like you and me. And a third of the emissions are dependent on sectors that are directly shaped or influenced by what local authorities do, by their policy, and through the partnerships that they are in. And I'll come on to that later. So for people to make those low carbon choices, we need an enabling infrastructure around us, the systems, information, skills, and it needs to be affordable as well so that we can make those choices. And that might be, as David mentioned, really good public transport, access to safe cycling and walking routes, excellent broadband. And I'm sitting here in my local town hall because my rural broadband is not good enough to support me talking to you today. And we need a supply chain who can retrofit my house reliably. So local authorities play a very important role in making it possible for us to make these decisions. So what's in the report? In the first section, we look at how all this fits together, what the plan is and where local authorities fit in anyway. So this chart shows at the top level the national government and national government agencies. Then we look at devolved administration, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and then the regions, how the distribution network operators, how our LEPs, combined authorities have a role to play. And then below there at that sort of paler pinky level, we've got over 400 local authorities, all sorts of types and tiers. And I don't even touch on the 10,000 local councils, the parishes, people operating at very much a very local community level. And all of these organisations provide a wide range of services and functions across these different scales and geographies. In England and Northern Ireland, we don't have a statutory duty to deliver on our Climate Change Act. And we see a distinct lack of cross-governmental departmental coordination. So often local authorities are pushed or pulled in different directions, which constrains what they can do. So one department from government might be supporting them to make low carbon energy systems, but on the other hand, somebody else, another department will be pushing them to build and meet their housing targets. And we have a range of different funding streams, regulations, and time periods which local authorities are delivering on. So that makes the the policy environment really difficult for local authorities to align around the net zero target whilst also delivering everything else they have to deliver. By contrast, in Scotland, they have a duty to deliver their Climate Change Act, and they're given quite a lot of support on doing that, and more integrated into policy making, as we see in the local heat and energy efficiency strategies. And in Wales, local authorities are more brought into the fold and included through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So the point we find is that we need to create more of a coherent national strategy to create a positive delivery environment for net zero. Moving on, we look at what local authorities can influence. Surely they only have a tiny carbon footprint themselves, and that's true in a local area. Their carbon footprint is quite small from their own buildings and operations, around between 2 and 5%. Excuse me. But they have a big procurement role, a commissioning role, and that gives them a broader influence, still quite directly under their direct control, if you like. And they have an incredibly important place shaping role through their planning policy, the work they do around highways, regeneration and transport. And that can lock in or lock out emissions. And the services they provide also through housing can drive and support supply chains. Moving out through this onion diagram, they are increasingly playing an important role in innovating and showcasing good practice, although I do say in the report, this is at a very tiny scale and it's often not replicated more widely. It can be a one-off. So we see more and more authorities trying to do this through their own housing companies, building to very high energy efficiency standards in Exeter, Swansea and Bristol, for example. And then more importantly, again, we have wider partnerships that can really bring organisations together, businesses, universities, other public sector organisations, to deliver on a bigger scale. And hopefully Mayor Marvin Rees will refer to the Bristol City Leap, where they're moving ahead to say, what can we do about heat and decarbonisation in Bristol? Big district heating scheme and ambitious plans for investment in home energy efficiency across the city. And then lastly, that lovely yellow colour, they play a very trusted role in engaging and including citizens and bringing them into the discussion about climate. And we see that through citizens' assemblies, the climate commissions in Belfast and Edinburgh, for example. But despite all of this, there are these gaps in powers and there are gaps in policy, particularly around governance for local energy systems, and how we work on delivering decarbonised heat and transport systems. And I don't really want to go near the planning system, which is in flux, but that is a really big obstacle, as well as a really big potential to deliver net zero across our local places. Buzzing on, the second section of the report talks about what current ambitions are in local authority areas. This isn't new to local authorities. A lot of authorities have been trying to tackle climate change over the last decade, but we saw the pace really slow down because of policy and austerity. But now through 2019 and 20, we saw more and more authorities declaring climate emergencies, and climate change came right back up the agenda, right back into our local authority cabinets. So this map's a little bit out of date now. Our Northern Ireland colleagues will be going, where are we on the map? And some authorities haven't declared an emergency, such as Central Bedfordshire Council, but which have still got strong delivery plans in place. The plans vary, the scopes vary. They've used a range of data sources and methods to deliver their plans. Some focus on their own emissions and some on the much wider area developed through partnerships. And in the research for the report, I engaged with all sorts of sizes and types of local authorities, with the Local Government Association, APSI and ADEPT, who Sue is representing here today, and spoke to people at the sharp end trying to deliver in housing, waste, woodlands and so on. And what's clear is that the skills and capacity at the local level need rebuilding after a decade of austerity, and local authorities need to be resourced and supported properly to deliver. And we are seeing an increase in a focus on this, increase in recruitment, And we're seeing climate change increasingly getting embedded into decision making at the council decision making processes, scrutiny panels, and we're seeing it in training as well. And I think the COVID pandemic has strengthened, not weakened, the local authority commitment to delivering on net zero, because we're seeing a much greater value put on our environment, and we saw those inequalities really come out. And I hope that government saw too that local areas and local authorities are critical to actually delivering things on the ground, and that's the same for climate change as it is for COVID. So moving on to what really needs doing, I hope Martin from Hull doesn't mind me quoting him. Heat being a huge challenge around decarbonisation. So in the report, we take you through sector by sector timelines for each of the emission areas through buildings, transport, waste, power, land use, including forestry and agriculture. And we look at what needs to happen, what the government's already committed to and is funding or financing and supporting, and then where the gaps are. So there's quite clear lists of what local authorities should be looking at, but there's an acknowledgement that it's not easy to deliver it because there are still gaps and uncertainties. The timeline piece is really important because local authorities are taking decisions now that are going to affect emissions over the longer term. So planning decisions now are going to lock in emissions into the future, and we're still building homes that aren't net zero and will need retrofitting. We're signing waste contracts that will last for 20-25 years. So local authorities need a clear steer and some certainty around what they should be doing and can do. And I cannot list all the actions that are in the report in this quick talk, but there's a bit of an overview here touching on where things are best driven nationally and where best driven locally. I won't take you right through that. So there are a lot of actions that need to be delivered, not all controllable by local authorities, but through wider partnerships, and they cut across all the service areas. I'll take you quickly through the cross-cutting recommendations to local authorities. So these are separate from the sectors, but things that need to be done more widely across the authority, starting with having a plan for the local area to get to net zero, but with a focus on delivery, monitoring and reporting that progress, both to the local people, but also centrally, so that there is data and information for central government policymakers to use to develop policy. And I think aligning and conducting service reviews to say, where are we doing one thing on one hand that's driving up emissions? That might be building a load of new roads you might not need. And on the other hand, there's somebody over here trying to deliver net zero. So bringing those together and identifying where there are contradictions in your own policy. Implementing training is absolutely fundamental and getting that embedded across the whole authority. We're seeing more and more authorities running carbon literacy training in energy systems that you're going to need. And then developing capacity to innovate and scale up, being ready to jump on projects when their funding comes along so that you can try things out and help bring in the private sector money, which will be needed to make these investments. And that includes collaborating across different areas. Developing that green finance know-how, which Sue and Marvin are busy doing, communicating and engaging with local authorities, and then there's what you do with your pension funds. But then lastly, I'll just touch on what the recommendations to government are. As I said, it's too hard at the moment to deliver all this, and we've been trying for a long time. It's like pushing a stone up a hill sometimes, and it should be easier. So what government needs to do, and this is what kept me awake all night all of last year, is how all this fits together and how can we put a framework in place that makes it easy for government to go, oh, we can deliver net zero because we've got this framework in place that brings all the right players together and facilitates everybody. So there's a framework where everyone fits in, but there's flexibility locally. So the local authorities who know their areas best can bring funding together, blend things and say what will work in their area. Obviously, financing is needed and that's got to be multi-year over a longer time period, but with sufficient funding to put the capacity in place to deliver. And then by facilitation, I mean having policy that doesn't contradict. So aligning policy from government departments so it doesn't fight with each other, so that if DEFRA is doing one thing, it works across MHCLG and BEIS. And I read the new fuel poverty strategy, and I was delighted to see that it looks at what different departments are doing to align on that, and then what the local role is. And I think I'm beginning to see some change coming through policy making. I'm optimistic about that. I think government has a great opportunity now to work with local authorities to get a coherent policy and funding environment in place to show COP26 that the UK's got a really good national framework in place to deliver on net zero. So that's been a romp through the 100-page report. Thank you for listening. And that's, that's the end.
I think that was fantastic. Louise, and you kept perfect time for such a long document. That was fantastic, and you do fantastic work. So I would now like to go to the first of our responses, and first up is Marvin, and then Sue.
Thank you very much, and it is something I and my team in Bristol really welcomed. Just so I don't miss it, it is potentially worth saying that we've set up our own Bristol Advisory Committee on Climate Change in the city that work with our City Environment Board as well, drawing on the firepower of our two universities. And it's great to have it. It doesn't work for me, it works for the city and our local and planetary responsibility, and drives into our policy making. As you mentioned as well, we do have City Leap, which again, we'd welcome people looking up and having a look at. We call it LEAP because it literally is a leap. It's a package of £1 billion worth of investment in everything from the generation to distribution, storage, and usage of energy in the city, and it offers a real chapter change in Bristol's relationship with energy. And again, not waiting for government, but just cracking on, developing an approach, and all hats. I'm not the expert on it. It is our experts here in the city and local authority that have driven that. So we'd be more than happy to share that as a story. I really welcome the recognition of the role of places, I would say, not just local authorities. I know that's the language and it's important, but it's actual places. Robin Hambleton, who's a professor at Bristol, talks about placeless governance, placeless politics, which happens at the national level. Where does it land? Politics at the local level actually lands in the lives of people that live here. And if we're going to make change, it has to be made real, and it has to be made real in places. The emphasis on partnerships is absolutely essential. When we declared a climate emergency in the city, one of the points I'll make is that if you simply look at what your local authority does, you miss out huge swathes of decision making in Bristol. Our National Health Service, our police, our private sector, our voluntary sector, all of which local authorities do not control, but have massive implications for what we do. Finance is hugely significant as well. I was on a call with C40 not too recently, and I said, as a mayor, I can go to any number of meetings where mayors share best practice. But the first question is, well, that's great. How are we going to pay for it? All right? Everything costs money. And let's remember, local governments have not been awash with money, and not just money to actually bring about the practice we want to bring about, but to support people through the transition. I've just had a half-hour call this morning with a local business that's terrified of the clean air zone, a gas business. They deliver Cala gas bottles, working class jobs, low-income households, saying, how are we going to afford to transition through this? I'm going to lose jobs. We've got to take that stuff seriously because that's real people's lives. And thirdly, there's another point that's made in there, which is about capacity within local authorities as well, which is massively significant. Austerity hasn't just meant the loss of frontline services. It's meant the loss of backroom capacity, expertise. People do not campaign for lawyers, planners, strategists, accountants, or even climate experts, right? They campaign for parks, libraries, and public toilets. And yet those are the people that bring the expertise to bear on a policy making that will allow us or undermine our ability to decarbonize the systems on which we depend. So, I mean, there's much more. I've done 3.5 minutes. There's so much more. I just love to say just a couple of points. One is, this takes more than political will. I hear this phrase thrown around a lot. That's so naive, right? Yes, it takes political will, but it also takes money, right? We're talking about billions of pounds worth of investment that need to be front loaded into city economies to decarbonize our systems now, right? We can do the hearts and minds, that's really important. But what we need to do is decarbonize the systems that people unconsciously need to survive in our cities. And again, we got to get that done now. If we want to deliver the carbon budget 6, we need to deliver 4 and 5. That means front loading that investment right here, right now. The need to recover economically needs to be tied up with decarbonising that economic recovery, generate jobs in the green economy, rebuild our cities, and generate and create jobs at the same time. In my last 30 seconds, what I'll also say is that this is not just, when we think about local government, this is not just about what we do in the boundaries for which we have responsibility. We need global governance to move into its next iteration. National governments working alone are not able to cope with the world's challenges the way they are. They're just too turgid, and they're too zero-sum in their relationships. What we need to be thinking about is the ability of cities and global networks of cities to shape the national and the international context in which they have to work. Cities having more of an opportunity to shape national and international policy. So I just want to open the door on that as well. Do not think of local government, city government as simply at the receiving end of national policy and priorities. I think we need to be thinking about the model of governance if we're going to unleash innovation and dynamism that national governments have been showing themselves unable to deliver working alone. That's not the end of national governments. It's not. We absolutely need them, but something more is needed on those international decision-making tables.
Mary, I very much endorse everything you said there. That's a thorough overview of, I think, where local authorities are at. My name's Sue Halliwell. Good morning, all. I'm here, as Piers introduced me, representing the coalition of local authorities, environmental and research organisations that have collaborated together to produce and publish the blueprint for accelerating climate action and green recovery at a local level. And my day job is exec director place for West Berkshire Council, and I very much agree with that statement around thinking about places and leaders of place and how we are affecting change. Firstly, I wanted to congratulate and thank the Climate Change Commission on both reports, and for engaging the coalition and also ADEPT on both of them. We firmly believe that local authorities have a fundamental role in being part of the solution. Speaking on the coalition's behalf, as I say, we welcome the carbon budget, which provides a really fundamental and vital roadmap to 2050. And we obviously welcome the recognition that local authorities play in their important role in that place shaping agenda and really affecting change at a local level. It's great to see that the scale and the ambition of local authorities has been recognised throughout the report. We know well over 300 councils have committed to taking action through the declaration, but as Louise has said, many more have already existing action plans that they've been looking to deliver over many years anyway, despite some of the austerity issues that local authorities have been challenged with. So there is a surge of activity that's really happening, and there's a wave of action that's going to be taking place, and it's really about how we make sure that that is the most effective action that we can take. We also work on the recognition that the local government sector is really at the forefront of the resilient and green recovery from the impact of COVID. This is something that's very much driven through the blueprints that we've published. The report for us really clearly draws out the numerous different roles that local authorities can play at a local level. And exactly as Louise said, this isn't just about our own carbon footprints from our own operations and our services. This is the influential role that local authorities can play at different scales. Somebody once asked me, what size is a place? Well, it can be any size. It's more about how you work within that place and how you can break down the silos. And that's one of the conversations that we're keen to have with government, particularly around the funding. As a place director myself, from my own experience, I recognise some of the opportunities but also the challenges that that we have in actually leading some of this work. My council at the moment, we've already established the community municipal bond to invest in zero carbon initiatives. We've committed to delivering a solar farm. We've got an extensive energy efficiency programme on our assets. That's been long-standing for several years. We're installing EVs, etc. I could go on. But really, this only just scratches the surface. The challenge and the scale is so significant. More needs to happen, and we've already touched on the challenges around retrofitting the planning system, creating the right environment to invest. The list goes on. So it's about how we work in partnership, both at a local level, but obviously also with government to actually enable these things to happen. I'm sure the team found delivering this report and doing the research quite challenging during COVID, but they did it and they delivered an exceptional piece of work. And for me, this just goes to show that we've responded despite the huge and horrific situation that COVID has put us in. We've actually proven that we can live and work differently, and there are some benefits for that. So for me, the critical thing is how we ensure that we hold on to those good behaviours and those opportunities to actually move forward from this exceptionally difficult chapter, holding on to those core behaviours that can embed zero carbon going forward and actually get to the target earlier. And in so doing, and I think Louise touched on this, we can't lose sight of the inequalities and how they've been highlighted through COVID, and how pronounced they've been through the pandemic, and that there are opportunities that we need to take forward, for example, around grid edge technology, enabling those low-income households to access zero carbon energy or other technologies to reduce their own carbon footprint, and ensuring that this is we address those inequalities. And we shouldn't forget that behind the tsunami of climate change is the tsunami of biodiversity collapse. So for me, I think it's disappointing that the Environment Bill has been delayed, and that the Planning for the Future, for example, consultation missed that opportunity around taking a lead on and embedding climate, environment and emergencies as principal or central principles for the planning system. But I'm an optimist, so I firmly believe we still have opportunities to make these things happen. And finally, just on the investment front, I think the budget next week, I think we're going to want to see the government's commitment in moving to zero carbon and seeing that criteria within some of the funding streams that should be made available. The fund, the Levelling Up Fund, the Shared Prosperity Funds. There's a real opportunity for government to actually show us that they're embedding zero carbon decision making in their own activities. So I think I'll leave it there and just finish by saying well done to the team. The two really strong reports, and I think they give certainly the local authority communities a really helpful framework and evidence to move forward.
That is fantastic, Sue.